Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Today on Ring of Fire, we'll tell you how the drug industry is pushing dangerous products that don't provide any benefits to the consumers. We'll also tell you why local police officers are as heavily armed as military commandos. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember you've stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Texas Governor Rick Perry's been indicted for corruption and abuse of power, and if convicted, he could be facing up to 100 years in prison. Joining me now to explain what's happening with his governor's office is Ian Millhiser, editor of Think Progress Justice. Ian, it doesn't appear that Rick Perry's glasses have been doing him a lot of good lately. You know, it just seems like, every time he starts sounding like a statesman, something weird happens. And although I look at this charge, it's actually pretty weak where it comes to any kind of conviction. But it's just, nevertheless, it opens up some discussion about what's going on in Texas. How do you see it?
Yeah, what he did here is probably not going to get him convicted, but it's still sketchy. So the story here is that the Travis County District Attorney has an unusual amount of power because she can prosecute and investigate state-level officials. She oversees Austin, which is the state capital. And one of the investigations that her office was leading was into this state agency that provides grants for cancer research and cancer treatment that was accused of some self-dealing, including some grants that went to people who are close to Perry.
In other words, they followed the money. They saw that it wasn't that they were just close to Perry. They'd put money into the political campaign, and it looked like a quid pro quo was here. You're gonna get some grants from this organization because of that.
Right. There were allegations of corruption that
right.
Something was going on where this money was going to people because they were good to Rick Perry and not because they were necessarily the best people to get these grants. Where this gets interesting is last year, the district attorney, who's a Democrat in Travis County, was arrested and convicted of a really serious drunk driving charge. She was very, very drunk. And it looks like Perry used the fact that she's now been compromised to try to push her out. When she refused to step down, he has a line item veto power, and he used that to strip her funding for this public integrity unit that was investigating this allegation of corruption with the cancer agency. And so there's no angels here. You have a DA who was driving while drunk and actually served jail time for it. You have Perry, and it looks like he's trying to take advantage of the fact that she's been compromised, and he's using his power in a really heavy-handed way to try to take out this unit that was investigating potential corruption that touches upon him. There are no angels here.
I think you would agree, though, if you look at the two different charges. I mean, the first possibility of anything having any kind of impact is the grant issue, where grants given to people that had been given money to the governor, and did the governor influence those grants? That's more of a public integrity quid pro quo kind of corruption case. But he has a constitutional right on the second part of it, whereas he vetoed money that would have funded the public integrity group. And he has a lot of wiggle room on that, doesn't he?
That's right. Yeah, there's a serious constitutional problem with this indictment, and that's that the governor has, under the Constitution, discretion to decide what he wants to veto and what he doesn't want to veto. And, there's probably some limits that could be placed on that. If Perry were taking bribes, the legislature could probably make those bribes criminal if he was actually selling his veto. But, the separation of powers in Texas does say that Perry has a great deal of control over his veto, and the legislature can't take that away without amending the Constitution, because that would be changing the allocation of powers between the governor and the legislature. So I think it's likely that any charges related to his veto are going to be thrown out, because even though they're scuzzy doesn't make something illegal, and it doesn't make an indictment constitutional.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is you have to get to the intent. You've got to be able to say that his conduct, that there was criminal conduct that was intentional. And when the Constitution says you have a power, now we may not agree with that power, but the Constitution says you have a power to use veto when you think it's appropriate. It's your discretion. It's almost impossible to look behind that and say, gee whiz, I see intent here. I mean, that's where that one falls. But I'm not so sure about the first part of this. I'm not so sure that the first part is not a bigger problem when the digging starts. It seems to me, though, that the Republicans kind of have it sounds like they're not exactly blessed with candidates that don't have this kind of hinkiness about them. I mean, you got Christie, he was going to be the guy. You got McDonald's going to be the guy. You have Perry's going to be. Either way you look at this, when you start looking at this, it starts raising issues probably that Perry would not want raised at this point. Don't you see that as a problem for him?
Potentially, yes. And I mean, that's why normally when an elected official misuses their power, the remedy, and it's generally a very effective one, is the electoral process. Perry's made no secret about the fact that he wants to be president. And I think that voters, including voters in the GOP primary, are going to take this into account. He doesn't have to be convicted of a crime. He doesn't necessarily even have to have committed a crime for voters to say, I'm looking at this and this doesn't give me a lot of confidence in his leadership. So it could hurt him even if he's not convicted.
Well, if you're a prosecutor, probably what you're looking at is this. You're saying, okay, this is one instance of his use of a veto power. But what about where we go back and we look at a course of conduct? We look at, did he use this veto or that veto, for example, to help a wealthy donor? Was there some veto process that you can look at in a little more detail and find all of a sudden we do see some intent? And that's what he really should worry about, because obviously this prosecutor is committed to looking into this. This is the same office that went after Tom DeLay. They did it aggressively. They did it appropriately. Of course, the appellate court in Texas took that away because everybody knew that was going to happen. But this is a lot of light being shined on that use of the veto power, isn't it?
I mean, there's light being shined here. Now, this indictment doesn't name some other veto. It names this one veto.
Right.
I think we should emphasize how challenging it's going to be for this prosecutor to prosecute Perry for any veto. I mean, even if he had some sort of nefarious intent, absent an actual bribe, I think it's going to be very hard to show that. Yeah,
intent is very difficult in a case like that.
Right.
Ian, good story. We'll keep up with it. I'll have you back on, and we'll see how this thing progresses. Thanks for joining me.
All right. Thank you.
The drug industry is trying to convince aging men that almost all of their health problems are due to low testosterone, but the truth is that there are virtually no conclusive studies to show that testosterone therapies are effective, but there's plenty of evidence to show us that they're incredibly dangerous if not done properly. Joining me now to talk about that is Tom Schneider, author of the book Physician's Apology. Dr. Schneider, it appears to be a feeding frenzy out with everybody selling this concept of low T. And I think that the bothersome thing about it is you can benefit from an increased increased testosterone if there's a plan. And unfortunately, these companies that are selling this it's almost like snake oil charlatanism. What's your take on it?
No, you're absolutely right, Mike. It is charlatanism. The problem is it's charlatanism not selling snake oil, but really dynamite. It's like snake venom because it really can hurt. Now, the beauty of it is that testosterone, you and I both know, it's a hormone, and we make it in our body. And as we age, we make less and less and less. So I'm a diabetic. my pancreas doesn't make insulin. So I take insulin every day. That's a hormone. Great stuff. Keeps me going. I like it. Keeps me alive. If I take twice my dose, I'm going to die. Insulin will kill me.
Well, isn't the problem, and I've read your book on this, I think I understand it, but your book is pretty clear. Your book is that testosterone can there are some benefits. But the industry invented this disease called low T.
Right.
And they call everything is called low T, and they made testosterone deodorant, testosterone gel, testosterone nasal spray. Tell me the problems with that. What happens when a guy just, or they even have off the shelf, hell, you can buy it at GNC.
Yes, you can.
What are the problems with that if it's not done properly?
Well, these are the biggies. The fact of the matter is that everything you've said is correct, but testosterone, we do make it. It is natural. It does decrease, particularly as we age. And let me throw in a plug here, Mike, first. It actually depletes faster in women. So in my practice, the majority of patients who were really low T were women. So men have glommed onto this. They have for years. Weightlifters, power wrestlers, they've all used testosterone and growth hormone because it works. It's the real McCoy. The problem is that it needs to be dosed just like aspirin. I can take one aspirin and it helps my blood and it does all sorts of things. I take a bottle of it, I'm going to die. The studies that were done recently that have caused this sort of furor were inadequate studies, as are, by the way, 87% of the ones that are put out. But that's another story. So they are flawed. And they're flawed because the patients were given high doses of testosterone.
Like what kind of levels? Give me an example.
Sure.
Give me an example.
Okay, so a healthy male who has low testosterone or fading testosterone and symptomatic, meaning having symptoms from it, would be on about 40 milligrams a week, maybe 50. That's a dose, a normal dose for a healthy male, you and me, okay, but with lowering testosterone. These patients were given 100 milligrams a week? No, 100 milligrams a day.
Okay. So isn't the part of the problem the delivery system with the, let's say androgel? Let's talk about the junk that's out there. You got creams, you got nasal sprays, you've got deodorants. Isn't the delivery system itself part of the problem because the cumulative nature of the delivery system? In other words, if a man wakes up and he's putting on deodorant, testosterone deodorant every day, doesn't it simply build up in the system and the levels can get extraordinary? I mean, isn't that part of the problem?
That is totally part of the problem and one other aspect, that when it's given over the skin topically, it absorbs underneath, and there is an enzyme underneath, a particular enzyme. It's called aromatase. And if you use it dermally or on your skin, the aromatase takes testosterone and turns it into estrogen. Now, we're all familiar with the problems of estrogen: increased weight, increased risk of cancer, and the list goes on and on and on. That's what's happening. So men who are taking underarm deodorant testosterone or any other type topically are saying, you know, I do feel a little better, but my tummy is getting bigger or I'm gaining more weight. Yeah, because you're converting to estrogen, and your doctor or these companies really don't know that if you take testosterone, it has to be given precisely, and you have to have safe precautions. And the biggie, follow-up. So I can put you on 40 milligrams of testosterone, but I want to know 8-12 months later, where's your blood count? Blood count goes up. Well, that's a good thing, doctor. No, blood count goes up too much. We have strokes, we have heart attacks, cardiovascular disease. So it really does have to be followed so closely.
The bad part of this is the estrogen,
Correct.
though. The estrogen is what's created by the testosterone. Unless you control the estrogen, that's what brings the heart attack to the male. That's what brings the increased risk of stroke to the male. And if you look at the packaging on these products, there's no mention of that. There's no mention that it ought to be monitored. There's no mention that there is a level you should not exceed. There's no mention that you need to block the estrogen buildup or the stuff can kill you. And the FDA, again, has allowed it to happen without any kind of oversight. It's just like there was this bandwagon of the low T bandwagon, and the FDA is driving the wagon the way this story appears when I read what you've written about it.
Absolutely. And you and I both know that the driving force for all of this is money, money, money. This is an amazing product in terms of marketability. And it runs rampant. I don't know of any product really that's taken off quite this much other than statins.
How is it marketed? Is it marketed, you don't have sex drive, you're tired, you're fatigued, you're getting fat? I mean, it's all of this marketing that the average male looks at and he says, well, hell, I want to find something to fix me.
Exactly. And therein lies the problem again, remembering 2 points, the Schneider rules. 1, last year, we killed 120,000 Americans by giving them medications that they shouldn't have been given. They died. More than twice the number we lost in Vietnam. That's what we lost last year because of medications. These are serious, serious medications. And the other big point is that it has to be, a medicine like this that's this potent, has to be monitored. Absolutely has to be.
Why is there such a difference in what camps of doctors are finding here? One camp of doctors says, absolutely, this stuff is going to kill you. The other camp, it's not clear.
Okay, so this is where I have to give my caveat. I am a doctor, an MD, not a minor deity, a real doctor, and so I can confess that we as physicians are not taught any of this. We are simply not taught it, and it is a very specific type of learning process. So in our town right here, I would say 99 to 100% of the physicians here have no idea that when you give testosterone, A, it needs to be monitored, and B, the estrogen effect is humongous. You must block that estrogen effect or you're essentially killing your patients.
Well, and there's the other requirements are exercise and proper dieting when you give it to them. Isn't that part of it also?
Yeah, you don't need to go to medical school. I'm always impressed when I come here. That's exactly right. I've been on testosterone for 20 years, and people say, wow, you're 70 years old, you look great, you feel great. I've had a number of medical problems that I've survived because of testosterone, but it is not because of testosterone. It's the symphony. Yes, I take testosterone. Oh, by the way, I exercise 7 days a week. Oh, by the way, I eat a little bit, often mostly greens. So you're right. It's this symphony approach, including the mind, that really plays into it. There's no price that you can pay for health, and testosterone is not going to give you that. It's just one aspect. But does it work? The answer is yes.
Tom Schneider, thank you for joining me, okay?
I love you, Mike. Be good.
Our economy's been slow to recover since the recession of 2008, and it turns out that one of the main reasons for that is because Wall Street's trying desperately to prevent that from happening. I have Mike Burg with me to explain what's happening on Wall Street. So, Michael, we thought, okay, we got a new president. Obama's talking tough on Wall Street when he first came into office, and he campaigns tough on Wall Street. Nothing's changed, though. I mean, is it safe to say nothing has really changed that affects Wall Street at all? This is business as usual. They're making more money. They're becoming richer than ever after stealing $18 trillion from us. Nothing's changed, has it?
Not only has nothing changed, but in some regards, it may have even gotten worse because at this point in time, the Obama administration had the ability to make the changes, and they didn't do it. And in fact, the big banks are not only, they were too big to fail before, now they're even bigger than that. Too big to jail. No one's gone to jail. They're continuing to do what they do on Wall Street, which is allowing and running the government in terms of trying to make sure that they continue to be able to do all the things they've done in the past. Securitized products are back. Nothing's changed.
Well, okay, so if you go down the list, you talk about securitized products, swaps, synthetics, CDOs, back in a big, big way, exactly the same trash that crashed us the last time. The biggest banks are bigger than they have ever been and are more concentrated than they've ever been during the Obama years. You've got subprime is making a comeback, interest rates as high as 8 to 13, as low as 8 to 13, actually, when you depending on how you look at it. High-speed trading. We're going to hear, the Obama administration, we're going to stop high-speed trading because it's theft, basically. It's Wall Streeters gaming the system. the housing crisis. I love when they declare the housing crisis is over. All that's happened is we're creating another housing crisis. We hear him bragging about the GDP as if it's great that we're in this austerity. You have actually talked a couple of times about how dangerous all of this is, but certainly austerity. We ought to be spending money where we can spend it, shouldn't we?
We really should. You know, what's interesting about the high-speed trading is there's been books written about it, but everyone's ignoring the fact is they're cheating. They get to go first. They know what's going to happen, and then they manipulate the market, whether it's a stock, whether it's a bond. It's going on there right now, and these big banks are basically they're going in, they knowing what's going to happen to the price within seconds before everyone else knows, and that kind of information. And they still, Congress, the Obama administration hasn't stopped it.
Well, and the Obama administration has admitted, yeah, it's corrupt, but they haven't done anything about it because they're so damn afraid that Wall Street's not going to give Hillary any money if they don't act right here. So again, and to add to that list, 95% of all the income, all the wealth, 95% of it since Obama has taken place has moved to the 1%. And this is Barack Obama saying, we're going to rebuild, we're going to change all this. Nothing's really changed. As a matter of fact, the question is, has it become worse? Now, there's some ideas, some things we could do. You have economists saying there's some very clear things we can do. Again, it's being ignored by the administration. The administration says, gee whiz, the Republicans are just so obstructionist, we can't do anything about it. Truthfully, almost everything in the list is something that can be done by executive order by this president if he chooses to do it.
Absolutely.
What are they?
Well, there's a lot. Let me first say, though, I can't tell anybody, honestly, that Romney would have done any better than Obama.
Oh, he would have been terrible.
He'd been worse. So I want to make sure that our audience understands that. But let me talk about what could be done. And they can do it right now. We have the worst infrastructure in the world. We have bridges crumbling, highways in disrepair. We don't have high-speed railroads. These are all ways, after World War II, after the Great Depression, during World War II, we recreated the WPA and we had jobs. You can have private industry go do our infrastructure with some, better to give tax breaks to those infrastructure. Solar energy. Why shouldn't all the government buildings have solar energy components to how they heat and cool their government buildings? There's a million ways. That helps our environment. It helps the climate. Well, it creates jobs. We have highways. We have roads, rail yards, wind farms. There's a lot of places that this administration could go that could create real jobs, long-term jobs. Everyone talks about the unemployment is down. Well, yeah, it is. But you know what? It's at the lowest end. It's not long-term jobs. One of the problems is, and we've talked about it a lot, Michael, which is, unfortunately, the big oil companies, the coal companies, the frackers, right here in Colorado, we know that fracking has created problems. We know that here in Greeley, they determined, Greeley, Colorado, fracking caused an earthquake. Well, that makes sense.
Okay, so your point being is and we've talked about this so many times, not just us, but every economist that's credible in the world, two Nobel Prize-winning economists have said the answer is simple. The answer is infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. If you put people to work on things like roads, on things like bridges, they get their paycheck, and then they buy television sets, they buy cars. But instead, you have this administration that is saying, oh, gee, look what we did. The deficit's falling. It's now just 2.8% of the GDP, as if that's reassuring that we're not putting money into the economy. And we know just the opposite of that should be what's happening, don't we?
Absolutely. It's one of those things that, again, the government's being run by the giant billionaires and the corporations, and they don't want it to go in the areas we're talking about, or these Nobel Prize-winning economists are going. They want it to go to the lowest end. They don't want minimum wage even raised, let alone create jobs, long-term jobs, building roads. How about the banks are not willing to invest into our country?
They're holding $3 trillion, Mike. That you did a story not long ago where you showed that $3 trillion is being held by the very banks who came to Bush, came to Obama and said, gee, if you'll bail us out, it's going to be the greatest thing for the economy. because what's going to happen is we're going to take our banks all over the country are going to be loaning to mom and pop businesses. And the media said, oh, how brilliant, this is the greatest thing in the world. And now the look back is that I think the number is something less than 15% has actually gone to do that. What they've done is they've simply bought up their own stock. They've made themselves wealthier with the taxpayer money that was paid to them. And the banks have done nothing to help the economy as far as investing into these into businesses.
Absolutely, that's correct. And unfortunately, we've allowed them to do that. I mean, we didn't put any contingencies on that money that we lent them, the billions and billions of dollars that were lent to these banks, and all they've done is used it for their own gain and hasn't put anything back into the United States of America.
What's Colorado, really quickly, what's Colorado looking like for Hillary? I mean, isn't Hillary just just a recap? It's just another Bill Clinton. It's just another Obama. It's just another Wall Street Democrat. Do you see this different out there in Colorado? Is there different? Well,
I think we are. I think we understand the alternatives, but we have to. What's great about Elizabeth Warren? One of the things is she's putting Hillary to the test, which is, are you going to be a progressive? Are you going to be different? And we're going to have to just wait and see. In Colorado, one great thing here is that the Democrats understand that whoever comes out of that Republican Party, and it's hard to know who it is at this point in time.
Oh, it's a disaster for him, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Romney again is back in the news that he's running again. Obviously, the Governor Perry, who just got indicted, he says he's running.
Christie, who's going to be indicted, is running. McDonald, who's in trial right now for corruption, he was going to run.
Right.
It looks pretty bleak on that side. Michael, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you, Michael.
The civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri has been made worse by the fact that the police officers were armed as heavily as military commandos, and they had almost no training in how to handle any of that heavy artillery. But that didn't stop them from threatening nonviolent protesters in the street. I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us to talk about what's happening in Ferguson. Chauncey, one thing we've known for quite a while, but it just seems like the Ferguson story is just bringing this out more and more. You don't put toys of war in the hands of police, especially police that aren't trained on how to use them. In a city, this is what's so crazy. A town of 20,000 people, where it seemed like the police started this whole thing playing dress up, ninja cop, commando cop. Yeah, the whole scene. They had the ninja hats on, the masks. They had guns on almost every appendage in their body. These are small town policemen. This is like Barney Fife dressing up for a commando raid. That's what it looked like. But the result of it has been awful, hasn't it?
It's, as I watched those events unfold, on one hand I wanted to be surprised, but given the history of law enforcement in this country, its use against people of color and the poor. And your point about militarization, I was actually thinking it was like Barney Fife meets Bull Connor. The way that communities are over-policed. And I was talking to a colleague about this, and I think the mainstream media has really dropped the ball in terms of how they describe the events in Ferguson. And think about this. This was not a riot by the people of Ferguson. This was a police riot against the people of Ferguson, and it was a national disgrace.
Okay, so what happens is all of a sudden we see these cats show up with Linko Bearcat armored military vehicles, attack helicopters that the Korean Air Force uses, 22-ton mine-resistant ambush vehicles, AK-47s, what they call audible blast systems, which can deafen people, wooden bullets. And these aren't people that have had training with this in any serious kind of way. These are people, it's almost like a dress-up game, and before you knew it, Ferguson was out of control. What are the ramifications long-term of this? Are there any?
I think people are going to be upset in the near term, but in terms of really thinking about the militarization of the police, one of the concerns I've had is, where are the civil libertarians on the right? Now, some of them have spoken up, but why aren't they marching with the people of Ferguson? How do we actually think about the relationship between the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex and the hundreds of billions of dollars that local police departments have received? And as I wrote on my own site, ChaunceyDeVega.com, got picked up by Salon and Alternet, this is a huge issue about human rights. I don't know if folks have been following this, but now we have international human rights organizations saying they're going to be on the ground in Ferguson because they never thought that they would see this sort of violence on this scale against the American people. So I do hope that all folks across the color line, and I was thinking about this and meditating on it, see this as a human rights issue. What happened in Ferguson with Micheal Brown is a human rights issue that should offend all people of conscience, regardless of their color.
Okay, so what we have now, the ACLU, of course, has been studying this militarization issue, and what most Americans don't understand is there's a program that the federal government has. It's called a 1033 program, where they actually give these small-town Barney Five-top policemen they give them things like these Lincoln Bearcat armored vehicles. They give them helicopters. And all of a sudden, you've got, I think it's $40 billion worth of equipment they've handed out that's just kind of left over from all the ridiculous wars we've been involved with in the Mideast. And so they don't have anything to do with it. They give them small-town cops, and before you know it, these small-time cops believe that they're at war with the very people they're supposed to be protecting.
And that's exactly the process. I mean, it's militarization begets more militarization. So the cops in Ferguson go on a riot against the people they have harassed, that they have racially profiled. They were out there all day. They get mad. And given now what we know about the autopsy, it looks like Micheal Brown was actually executed by this police officer.
What is it about the autopsy that's most striking to you?
The fact that he was shot with a position they're indicating now from the top down in his head, indicating that he was falling. The fact that where the bullets went through would indicate that he was surrendering. And this corroborates everything that we have heard from the witnesses. Now, here's something else to think about. The town of Ferguson and these police are so invested in protecting this one white cop who killed this black kid that they're willing to destroy the town, lock people up, and harass journalists. This is the ugliest example of white supremacy in action, where instead of saying, you know what, let's cut the losses with this guy. He's clearly guilty. Let's go and indict him. No, we're willing to run ramshackle and ramshot for days and days and days over this community of people that we have harassed for years.
Well, I mean, you talk about the autopsy, and I agree with you. Anybody looking at the forensics on this sees that this kid was running away, and that the police were pursuing him after he had already been shot, holding up his hands, "Don't shoot," and he's shot in the head twice. What is the sequence that you're able to tell from what happened there?
I think what happened was, and another interesting detail is that the convenience store owner, now we got the chief in a lie here too, said he never reported this incident to the cops. So it couldn't have been out on the radio for this police officer to be suspicious. I think they saw these two young black men walking in the street. They harassed him. They had an argument.
Let's start with the beginning. What were the two men doing in the street? I mean, what was it, a time of day issue? What was going on here?
I think they were guilty of walking and being black. And I mean, if we think about the history of this country, that's not hyperbole. In many parts of the country, it was actually illegal for black folk, and they'd have to get off the sidewalk when a white person was coming by. So this is a pattern of over-policing. It's related to stop and frisk, and it's also related to these quote-unquote quality of life crimes.
Okay, so these two men were walking. There was a stop and frisk incident. What happened then from the facts that we can tell?
Then I believe the officer then tried to grab Mr. Brown, and trying to grab him, he shot him in the car, and Mr. Brown tried to escape, which is what all the witnesses are saying. The cop shoots him again. He stops him, puts his hands up, and he's saying, "Please don't shoot me, I surrender." And I think the police officer executed him.
So he obviously was not shot in the head at the time he put his hands up in the air and said, "Please don't shoot me." The officer could have done any number of things to disable him. He'd already been shot at that point. Is that your point here?
That's my point. So, police have a lot of discretion, and this officer chose to repeatedly shoot Micheal Brown, and his colleagues chose to leave him in the street, and they chose to deny the paramedics, apparently, the opportunity to even attempt resuscitation. This is an execution.
How long was he in the street, Chauncey?
Based on what I heard today, about 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours, and the police were, rude and disrespectful to the parents, to witnesses. I mean, this whole thing, as I said, I shake my head, but it's nothing new. Folks of color who live in these communities know that the police do not exist to protect and serve us.
So as far as the facts that you have, he's laying in the street for 3 to 4 hours. Forensics aren't allowed to come in. Pathology's not being able to where they can tell an awful lot about a shot. They can tell the trajectory. They can tell the distance. They can tell which shot has taken first. They can tell which shot has actually ended their lives. There's a lot of things they can tell from all this. None of that was done. We don't know any of the facts except what's been fed to us at this point, right?
Absolutely. And that's where I think a lot of the anger and rage comes from, and it's justifiable anger. And when you think again about the police behavior, you see this repeatedly. You have the cover-up. And if the police were sincere and direct and took their obligation to black and brown folks, and also poor white folks too, because I bet you a lot of this stuff also happens in rural America too, they would have released the information in a transparent and consistent way. Instead, they were more invested in protecting a police officer and taking days to even release his name and his information.
So all of a sudden, ninja cops prevail. We have a new way that we have a new way that we arm our local policemen, and rather than being policemen that are connected to the community, they become guards. And it's like one big prison. If you do something wrong, we're going to bring out our tanks. We're going to bring out AK-47s. We're going to bring out the tear gas. We're going to bring out the attack dogs. We're going to bring out all this militarization that we've been given by the federal government. No need to try to work something out like a beat cop in New York might do. A beat cop in New York is connected with that community. It becomes important for them to stay connected. That doesn't seem to be the case right now anywhere in the country, actually. Chauncey, thank you for joining me, okay?
Rapid.
The Koch brothers have finally decided that they need to purchase the third branch of government, so they've decided to start funding the state Supreme Court races. And they aren't alone. Corporate money is flowing into judicial races all over the country. I have Howard Nations with me to talk about what this means for our courts and for democracy. You know, Howard, I was actually in Texas trying a 3-month trial when the whole spectrum of the judiciary went to hell. And that was because Karl Rove had the idea of replacing judges all over the country, from Texas to California to New York to Florida, and making them into Republican, conservative, talking head puppets. He was very successful when I was out there trying that case. I think 90% of what you would call the progressive judges were completely thrown out of office. And then he left Texas, and he started doing that all over the country. And the reason he did it, if you look at what he says he wanted to nullify laws that he didn't like. In other words, if legislature writes a law, hell, I've got a judge over here, he's going to overturn it.
That's right. Well, of course, in Texas, he was very successful with it, too, because the Texas Supreme Court is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Republican Party and of the corporate interest in this state. You can't possibly get a fair trial as a plaintiff in a personal injury or malpractice case in Texas, because you may find a favorable jury. You find juries in the Valley or in Austin in some of the more progressive communities, but it doesn't matter. You get a verdict, it's going to be overturned by the judges that Karl Rove helped put on the Supreme Court and on now virtually every appellate bench in the state. So you're going to lose an independent citizen who gets a verdict is going to lose it in the Supreme Court.
Howard, let me tell you how ugly it is. We had one of our lawyers trying a case out there in Texas. The woman was completely paralyzed. All she could do is move her eyes. There was no question about liability, absolute no question about liability. And the issue came down to one that should have been a jury issue. Okay, in other words, a jury should have decided. A Republican judge that had just been appointed to the court the year before threw the case out. The liability was staggering. I mean, the wrongdoing on the other side was staggering. This woman will never walk again, never talk again. She has to speak with her eyes like Stephen Hawkins. And so this judge threw it out. And as a matter of fact, they tried to appeal it from there. The appellate court said no, it died. And then we come to find out that this judge that George Bush had appointed, her husband was one of George Bush's biggest fundraisers. Yeah. So that is where the judiciary is headed. And unfortunately, you have Karl Rove going throughout the country saying, you know what, I want Texas to be the example of how judges should be all over this country. That's his new talking point, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I'm sure he's absolutely right. That's exactly what he wants, because we have absolutely no justice for the injured parties in the state of Texas anymore. If it ever gets to an appellate court, it's over.
Who are the people behind this? What are the organizations that we need to be
aware of?
Well,
the organizations that are behind it, Pap, are the usual suspects. You have the Koch brothers, of course, and then you have the Republican. What's happened is in 2010, after you had the decision in Citizens United, Justice John Paul Stevens, in his dissent in Citizens United, said that decision was going to unleash the floodgates of corporate and Union General Treasury spending And now what's happened is exactly that. Money's gone into presidential races, congressional races, gubernatorial races, state legislatures, and we did a bit recently about the state AGs. Now their current target is the judiciary, because if they can elect judges who are pro-corporate, pro-conservative, they can successfully legislate from the bench,
okay,
which is
so
exactly what they do.
You've got this thing, this RSLC out there that is being paid for by big money donors like the Koch brothers.
Right.
The RSLC is a 501c4. Now, here's where it really gets ugly. And unfortunately, we have an IRS that won't do anything about this. But it's very clear. It's very clear that this 501c4 is put there because they've signed an affidavit that says they will not participate in political action groups. They will not get out and involve themselves in politics, that they are there for positive social change. Now, we find out the RSLC, 90% of their money has gone to judges' races where they're out there saying we need to change politics by way of judges' races. IRS doesn't seem to be willing to do anything. This administration won't do anything. Department of Justice won't do anything because it's a ne'er-do-well Department of Justice. And so this continues just to go on without anybody asking any questions.
Well, the same thing's true with the SGLF, which is a state government leadership foundation, which, for example, in a recent election in Tennessee, judicial election, there was a total of $1.5 million spent on TV ads. $500,000 of that money came from that one organization. They ran attack ads against 3 Democratic judges. And you know, the effect of this type of attack ads that they're now using, which is a standard fare now in these judicial races, is that many of the qualified candidates won't run now because the judicial temperament is considerably different than a political temperament, and they won't. There's got to be an effect on fundraising, on the impartiality of judges.
What happens? What we see happening with the studies are the least qualified people end up saying, yeah, I want to be a judge, because you got a guy out there who's nothing more than a Republican political hack, hasn't done anything, intelligent as a judge or as a lawyer. So you got a guy out there making $80,000 a year. He thinks if I run for judge and I win, I maybe can make $100,000. They're terribly, terribly unqualified. They have no experience. They're political hacks being put in place simply because of politics. And unfortunately, they nullify any good legislation that might be protecting the consumer or the victim out there. Isn't that kind of how it works?
It's exactly how it works. The big advantage that corporate money has is that they have the money going in so they can go out and find the compliant candidates that you're talking about who want to be judges. Judges who don't have corporate backing have to get out and dial for dollars, often from attorneys such as you and I, with the potential effect on impartiality. And you got to give it to the Republican Party. They are so far in the lead on this thing. The Democrats are far behind the curve. Democrats have raised 1/3 as much money as the Republicans for statewide races. And again, this year, in 2014, the president of the RSLC, who's Matt Walter, predicts that they're going to spend north of $5 million on judicial races.
Do you remember what that idiot? Do you remember what the idiot Rahm Emanuel said 2 years ago, or 3 years, or maybe 4 years ago? He says, "Judges' races don't matter to Democrats. We don't have anything to worry about. What we need to worry about is the White House and the Senate." And here's the crazy thing: the Senate can write all the laws they want. The president can come forward with ACA. He can come up with environmental laws that are great. He can come up with consumer laws that are great. But then that political hack, that little pimp, the Republican pimp in the black robe that's on the bench because he played the political game, can take all that away with one order. And that's what Karl Rove was talking about, isn't it?
There's one other very big important thing that the judges do too, and that is the Republicans control the United States House of Representatives, and they're likely to retain control for the foreseeable future, despite the fact that they have a 9% approval rating, possibly the worst record in history of any House of Representatives. The reason they'll stay in power is because of redistricting and gerrymandered districts, and the people who grade the papers on the gerrymandered districts are the judges. So
Howard,
that's a very important reason why they want to keep control of the judges.
Howard Nations, thank you for joining me. Another ugly story that nobody's paying attention to. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Big Pharma is great at pushing unnecessary drugs onto American consumers. The biggest problem is that many of the industry's latest blockbuster drugs are less effective and less safe than the drugs that they've been out with for decades. Joining me now to talk about one of the latest blockbuster drug failures is Ned McWilliams. Ned McWilliams, Xarelto, the killer drug of the week. When does it stop? I mean, this is almost black humor, what we see coming out of the FDA nowadays.
Well, it's just the same story over and over again, unfortunately. Yeah, well, Xarelto, it's the latest one in this whole line of drugs that's doing the same thing. Literally hundreds, if not thousands of people bleeding to death because of the drug.
Okay, lay it out for us. What is the drug? Why do people take it? Why don't doctors know that they shouldn't give it to their patients?
It's called Xarelto. It's part of this whole new class of drugs that came out with Pradaxa and also a drug called Eliquis. They're all meant to replace warfarin, and it's for elderly folks who have atrial fibrillation, which is just a heart arrhythmia. The thing is that that's a very large population. We're talking about millions of Americans with atrial fibrillation who they're trying to push these drugs on through all the direct-to-consumer advertising that I'm sure everyone's seen. But what I think people don't know is that the people that have actually investigated the safety of this drug, like the two primary doctors at the FDA, they actually voted against this drug getting approved. They said it should not get approved. They said it doesn't look safe. It doesn't look effective. And they gave very good, explicit, specific reasons. And the bureaucrats just vetoed them, trumped them.
Why? I mean, because they were. We've seen so many times where the bureaucrats actually end up working for the industry. In other words, the bureaucrats working their day one, day two, the industry comes and says, "Hey, we'd like to give you a raise of $300,000. Oh, by the way, what about helping us with this drug?" It's bribery. I mean, it's nothing short of bribery.
I think it's a combination of the revolving door you see between industry and the regulators, but also the thing that I think you coined, the captive agency. We have this agency where they just do not have the power, or they're just enamored by the power of these drug companies. Here we're talking about Bayer and Johnson & Johnson, two of the behemoths, two huge multi-billion-dollar drug companies.
On Xarelto, so we're talking about Xarelto here. In Xarelto, you have these huge companies coming in and basically pushing the FDA around, holding out these gifts, if you would, for the FDA types, saying, I know you're only making $120,000. Come with us and make $300,000. And oh, by the way, can you help us with getting approval on this drug?
That's part of it. But another part, Pat, that I think a lot of people don't understand is the lack of power that the FDA has. They don't have much power. And I actually found a document the other day when I was researching this topic where the FDA, someone within what the FDA wrote, and they said, look, and it's the core allegation in this case is that a simple blood test could improve patient safety. And the FDA says, look, the data appears to show that a blood test could improve patient safety. But for whatever reason, the drug companies aren't interested in pursuing this avenue. And so the FDA acknowledges that they just do not have the power to require the companies to do what the FDA believes is right. Which is just ludicrous.
What are other important points about this Xarelto story that really just cause you to get angry when you know there's how many people this is killing?
Well, for the start of the matter, we don't need it. We have a drug that tried, true, tested called warfarin that doctors have been using for 50 years, and it's cheap. It's $300 a year. These new guys on the market, they're selling it to our grandparents, and they're telling them it's cheap. It's cheap and quick, and you don't have to go to the doctor anymore. But they're charging them $3,000 a year for this drug.
You don't have to monitor. Their argument is you don't have to monitor the blood amount.
Exactly. You don't have to do the regular blood test, which is true. But the fact of the matter is, if you did a simple one-time blood test or a yearly blood test, you could greatly improve patient safety, and they know this. There's a recent huge expose in the British Medical Journal just in the last couple weeks where they said that the same thing is true for another one of the drugs in the class. And so there's no.
Wait. When you say drugs in the class, what do you mean? There's a class of drugs that you're talking about here. It's not just Xarelto; it's other ones too.
It's Xarelto, Eliquis, and Pradaxa, and there's a new one that's coming down the pike. I don't know the trade name of that yet. I think it's called Indoxapan is its generic name.
Okay, but we're talking about Xarelto here, and the
Yes, sir.
FDA is doing what with Xarelto? Are they doing anything to stop this?
Absolutely nothing. I mean, and they're going to get into it. They're going to dive in. Their market share is going up. People have been paying more attention to it. I know that there's a lot more attention to the whole class of drugs in general, and I think eventually we're going to get to a place and a point in time where all these drugs require at least a one-time blood test just to make sure you're getting the right dose. And that's going to happen. But I think some other concerning things about Xarelto is, again, if you dive into the data, is that the way you measure how well this drug performs is you do a head-to-head clinical trial, which is what they did here with Xarelto. They compared it to warfarin. But the thing about warfarin is you have to constantly change the dose, and you can measure how well you do that. And they did it very poorly. They managed warfarin very, very poorly, and yet Xarelto still had more strokes and more bleeds than warfarin, even in poorly controlled warfarin. And that's another one of the reasons why the people at the FDA voted against approving the drug, the actual scientists, the doctors. But the bureaucrats, again, overruled them.
Okay, so obviously if somebody's on Xarelto right now, the doctor most of the time is not going to know a lot of these issues we're talking about. I mean, that sounds odd, but the doctor really won't even know that maybe the clinicals aren't quite right or what the clinicals are actually showing, or that maybe they shouldn't be on this drug at all, because there's something called direct-to-consumer marketing. Explain that, would you?
Yeah, well, the thing is, there's market research that shows that 9 out of 10 doctors will prescribe a drug to a patient if the patient asks for it by name. And that's why in the United States, the drug companies, pharmaceutical companies spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on direct-to-consumer advertising, which is really it's really asinine. It's crazy that why would you be advertising to patients when the patients don't have the power or the ability to actually write these prescriptions? It's the doctor's choice. It's the doctor's decision. Yet they know the influence they have through these patients, and the doctors just don't have the time to do all the research, and they ultimately just have to trust the FDA and their peers and the drug companies that they're giving them safe medicine.
And what a mistake that is! What a terrible mistake that is. Ned McWilliams, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Pat.
Are you ready? The Pap Attack.
In the 1980s, Bayer Corporation produced a medicine that was supposed to improve the lives of hemophiliacs. Bayer didn't tell those hemophiliacs that their product was infected with HIV. Because of that, entire families of hemophiliacs died with AIDS as the virus spread within households. When Bayer was ordered to stop selling their drug in America, they dumped their AIDS-laden product in Asia and killed Asian families. No one with Bayer management was arrested. No one who made these psychopathic quality decisions went to prison. They claimed the protection of their status as a corporation. That corporate status gave management the ability to kill people for profit and not go to prison. I handled the civil case against Bayer and saw firsthand that this was a rogue operation, not typical of most corporations. But how do you put that rogue in prison? Who do you arrest? Today, rogue corporations have the best of all worlds. They take advantage of the constitutional protections that were originally written for living, breathing humans. They argue that the U.S. Supreme Court mandated 130 years ago that we must treat corporations exactly like we treat people. They argued that the 14th Amendment was written to protect their corporate person status with equal protection and due process. But when the conduct of that corporate person is so vile that they make decisions to kill people to increase profit, we hear the argument that it was a corporate-wide decision. We hear that there was no single person to hold accountable. They tell us that many people were involved in the acts, and we can't throw that corporation in prison. The U.S. Supreme Court expanded the definition of person even further for American corporations. The big winner were the corporations that are the most corrupt. This is a Supreme Court that is packed mostly with lawyers who were employed by America's most powerful corporations before they became judges. It's a court full of judges who sit on the court largely because the corporate powerhouses they once represented helped put them there. Their decisions are predictable. When this court finished writing its opinion about treating corporations more like people, the product they delivered looked like one of those warm and fuzzy Hallmark greeting cards that rallies our emotions with feel-good pictures of puppies and kittens and cherub-like babies. By way of words, they're going to paint a Norman Rockwell-like picture that's going to make us want to invite this saint-like corporate person to dinner with our families. A word of advice, though, if you do invite him over for dinner, send the children to another room and count the silver settings before this corporate person leaves the house. Most importantly, recognize that Mother Teresa character that the U.S. Supreme Court tries to sell you has more in common with Freddy Krueger. As this court expands the constitutional protections of this poor, misunderstood entity known as the corporate person, they should also spend some time expanding avenues that allow us to do what we do with any psychopath who harms our family. Put handcuffs on them and throw them in prison. That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or at Twitter, Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire. We perpetuate a culture of crime all the way from Wall Street right down to the main street in our hometowns. It's worse than it has been since FDR took control of the problem and said we can't count on industry taking care of the American labor. They probably have already engaged into some type of criminal cover-up, and the law prohibits the government from even doing anything about it.
Catch America's lawyer Mike Papantonio on YouTube at youtube.com/GoLeftTV.